separate but equal, that is the legal doctrine from 1896, where essentially our government and our Supreme Court said that it didn't matter if you violated the 14th Amendment through segregation, it was completely justified at the time. But what if I told you that we could be heading to that direction again in this country as it relates to the college campuses? Well, one researcher says that. Joining me now is Dion Pierre. He's a National Association of Scholars Research Associate, and he just finished a compelling research document called Separate but Equal Again. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As you know, campus reform at the Leadership Institute follows you guys research all the time. So if you could just sum it up for the audience, what is neo-segregation?
Neo-segregation describes voluntary or institutionally supported segregation of racial minority students in the post-Brown versus Board of Education era.
So this is after Jim Crow. This is after this movement of, I guess, when first affirmative action was enacted. And the case that you make is that we're doing it again.
Yes, 14 years after the Supreme Court decided that segregation was not only illegal but immoral, elite institutions of higher education found themselves setting up segregated dorms for black students. It's the untold story of the 60s, as the rest of the country was looking forward towards a colorblind era. Universities were instituting race on campus.
So describe to me how we got to this point, because for so long, many of us, as well as our ancestors, civil rights leaders, wanted to be a part of the American dream. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to be separate. They wanted to drink out of the same water fountains. They didn't want to go through the back entrances. They didn't want to have separate dorms, or they did that because they were required to do that. So how did we get to this place of wanting separation and segregation again?
The story begins with college's decision in good faith in the 1960s to admit black students in larger numbers. The other side of that story is that they admitted many black students and other minority students without regard to academic qualification. This caused many of those students to come to campus and feel that they were there merely for show. This was exacerbated by the mass exodus of their friends. At Yale University, the black freshman class of 1966 saw 35% of its students drop out after 1 year alone. So many of these students decided that one way to stem the tide of attrition and to make black students feel more comfortable on campus was to have segregated black clubs, segregated pre-orientations for black students, also a black studies curriculum. So this story of neo-segregation goes all the way back to the beginning of affirmative action.
So how did this impact the campus, and how is it impacting the campuses today?
Well, these programs have lived on for 50 years. The first one happened, one of the first happened at Wesleyan University in 1969. A black student group there called Ujamaa started the Malcolm X House. The Malcolm X House stayed. A few years later, Wesleyan attached its Afro-American Studies program to the Malcolm X House, thus symbolizing in the minds of students the arrival of blacks on campus, they're being respected in the curriculum. And these programs have stayed and they've been with us. Wesleyan's Malcolm X House is still standing, and attached to it is the now it's the African American Studies Department. It has created throughout the years all kinds of turmoil on campus, specifically the Malcolm X House in its early days. Many students suspected that people were keeping weapons in the Malcolm X House. It was a hub for all kinds of radical black nationalist politics, and students observed at the time that the policies that Wesleyan was supporting seemed to be racializing the campus rather than creating racial harmony. And so today you see incidents like the mobbing of Nicholas Christakis at Yale that was led by Yale's several minority identitarian student groups. Whenever essentially there is a racial provocation on campus. The students that live and operate within these segregated programs come out to demand some kind of action from the administration. They often have a back channel to the administration. That goes back years as well. Most recently, if you're following Williams College, the black student groups there are asking for a segregated dorm. They're in talks with the vice president of campus life, with university trustees. That's a pattern that also goes back to the 1960s. Black student groups demanded to speak to donors. They demanded to speak with the president, and the administrators at those schools decided to negotiate with these students and to give them much of what they want.
So let's go back to that period of time, because many people would say that we're at these schools during this period of time when integration first happened, that many of those students weren't welcome at the time on those campuses and didn't have access to those clubs, and there was still some hostility, even though times a lot of America wanted to move forward. Still on those campuses, there were still people being judged by the color of their skin. So did these clubs start off with good intentions to give people a place to call home, or do you think that this was always an intention to always be separate?
At Yale University, the intention was to be separate. There was a great longing for black nationalist ideas in the 1960s, particularly in the early 1960s. A rift between, I guess what you could call the establishment integrationist black leaders and the separatist black leaders occurred, and the two had to sort of jockey for influence in black America. Black students, however, decided what they wanted. It was Malcolm X, it was Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, a lot of the guys coming up around that time. Dick Tolbert, he was the founder of the Black Student Alliance at Yale. He was interviewed, I believe, in 1967 and asked why black students started BSA. And the reason he gave was that they wanted to be separate, that they wanted to find in separatism a degree of ethnic pride they believed that other racial groups had. It is possible that many of these students felt unwelcome on campus, but the conditions in which they were accepted to campus created that kind of atmosphere. Everyone in the country knew that universities were lowering admission standards to get black students into elite colleges because they feared that the race riots that were occurring at the time would swallow up the universities. That was the reason, as described by Jerome Karabel, who did an extensive history of how Princeton, Yale, and Harvard were integrated in the 1960s. The conditions at the time were terrible. You had the Watts riot, you had riots in Detroit, riots in Harlem. People were watching that and thinking that we were on the verge of a second civil war. So affirmative action in the 1960s, but that's what it came to be known as. I prefer the term racial preferences, but it was a kind of political compromise. And many of the black students who were recruited at a school like Wesleyan, for example, were recruited only because of the color of their skin. Wesleyan didn't want nerds. They wanted people who, quote unquote, were chock full of strength.
But is it fair to say that during that period of time, that although they may have lowered the standards, a lot of those schools during that period of time did not want people of color? Even after laws were changed, after the country was trying to move forward, there were still universities that resisted that change to allow people of color in those universities and colleges?
So that's a very complicated history. Schools like Wesleyan and Yale had admitted and matriculated black students in small numbers over the years. These are students who, however, who met the admissions requirements.
Do you think
the SAT has a...
So do you think the only reason why they weren't admitting people, and I'm not just talking about Yale and Princeton, but the colleges and universities at large, they weren't, do you think even after the laws were passed, the only reason why they weren't admitting them was because of their grades?
Yes.
Or do you think race played any part?
I'm sure that race played some part in it, but colleges, until very recently, were very careful to admit students who they were sure could handle the workload. There's a similar situation happening today in Stuyvesant High School. Many people are upset that only 7 black students were accepted this year. It's a predominantly Asian school. But the question is not whether these students are being discriminated. It's why black students aren't performing as well on the test. And of course, there's lots of debate about what tests measure and things like that. But the SAT had a discriminatory effect. It was not inherently discriminatory. I know that's a very, very big debate, but that's my position. In the 1960s, colleges decided that the threat of political turmoil, the threat of political violence by black Americans was too great to let happen. And so they decided that, Thomas Sowell noted this in the 1960s, they weren't even going to take many middle-class black students. They specifically wanted those from the inner city who were least likely to do well at those schools. As soon as those students came, they struggled with the curriculum. Gertrude Hughes, she was an English professor at Wesleyan. She later recalled that many of the black students she knew complained that they had trouble reading, they had trouble writing, they couldn't understand anything, no matter how hard they studied, no matter how many times they memorized it or tried to memorize it. It's not that these students did anything wrong, it's that these universities accepted them for political purposes, and these kids began to feel like they were there for show.
Do you believe that during that period of time also, before we move on, that the kids that were being, that were applying to the universities during that period of time, because we were going through desegregation at the period of time, that they actually had a fair chance to even have that academic depth to get into those schools? Many of them, I'm not talking about, of course there were always some outliers, but during that period of time, the quality of education that was given to other schools, do you feel like those students got that same quality education to compete against their other white counterparts?
Well, I think many students of color in the 1960s were learning in conditions that many poor rural whites were learning in as well. If you take students from underserved schools and just plop them down in Yale, they're not going to do as well. I do believe that...
Even with the racial tension?
I believe that black students had extra barriers to overcome because they were the first at the Ivy League and they had something to prove, but they were in over their heads because the universities needed to make a political point.
Let's talk about you. And you went to college. So walk me through what life was for you as a college student.
I came into college thinking that America had realized the post-racial ideal. I did not find myself wanting to segregate.
And why did you feel that way? Why did you feel like America had it? Is it something that was shaped at home, your family, church?
Well, my 9th grade year was the year Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. It seemed to me that our country had overcome much of the racial tension that had plagued us for many, many years. I also grew up in an incredibly, I hate to use the word diverse, area of Queens, New York, and we had all kinds of people. We had working class white people, we had Indo-Guyanese people, West Indians, Black, Bengali. So I've been very used to interacting with all kinds of people. I've not only lived in New York, but I've lived in upstate New York, I've lived in North Carolina, in the South, in predominantly white schools. So I, in my life, had managed to meet tons of Americans, and I don't ever remember race inhibiting my ability to form friendships or have conversations with people. And I took that approach to college. It seemed like college was a place to be liberated from that in some sense.
So when you got to college, you probably, just judging by our conversation, you had never experienced racism or anything like that in your adult life, in your young life before you got to college?
When I was in 6th grade, some kid said the N-word, but they got in trouble. I mean, there's some kid that, some random kid in middle school.
So other than that incident, you had never experienced it. Then you get to college, and what do you experience there?
I get to college, and I think that the only bigotry I had ever experienced came from white liberal students. They were surprised to meet someone who read as frequently as I did, who was versed in issues. I'd say that's the only slight I ever received.
But as far as the culture on the college campus of, the separate groups, the clubs and all of that, was that alarming for you since you hadn't,
Hofstra's just racializing.
Yeah.
Hofstra wasn't a racialized place when I was there. They've just started a student color graduation, a student color retreat. They're copying what elite schools are doing. But when I was there, gosh, the idea that I was choosing or would have chosen my friendships based on the color of people's skin is it's alarming and frightening. When I learned that people were doing it, I was just surprised.
And you graduated in what year?
2016.
2016. So not too far. So do you believe that in this 2-year frame, obviously because of the research, we know that this has been bubbling for a while, but do you think that this, in this past 2 to 3 years, that there has been this uptick of racialized education on the college university, or has it been going on for?
It's been happening for 50 years. Hofstra just wasn't that kind of school.
And what do you think made them go that direction?
The other schools?
Yeah, no, Hofstra. Why are they
I'm not sure.
going now?
I haven't been there, but I've recently heard stories that a group of students is demanding that a statue of Thomas Jefferson that stands outside our student center be removed. We just never had anything like that when I was at school, and I don't know, maybe this is just a cultural meme that's picking up with younger generations of students, but the idea that someone would be reported for having a conservative opinion, the idea that someone would try to stop an event by the college Republicans, or we had a whole Bush conference in 2015, I believe, no student protesters. It's just not something we did.
So is it fair to say to you, because we've reported on Hofstra a lot, that the diversity issue when it comes to the college campuses today is the diversity of thought and not race?
What do you mean?
Do you think you're less likely to be accepted as a conservative student or a libertarian student than you are of a person of color when you get on campus? I'm not talking about the admission process, but I'm talking about as far as having that culture of diversity that you experience in Queens, where people are able to talk and love one another and have conversations. Not saying you're going to agree on everything. Is the thought of conservatism and libertarian principles welcome on the college campuses?
For the most part, no.
And why is that?
I think people have been reared in an era of the university that was very much shaped by the 60s radicals. And the ideas they taught students said that the United States was a bad place, that it was irrevocably racist, the source of the world's problems, that people really couldn't get a leg up here. And I think a lot of students have bought into that idea. It also just seems cool and hip. You believe in progress. Well, progress towards what? Most students aren't very sure, but the idea itself sounds appealing.
You brought up that schools are playing politics, right, as it relates to race. And you talked about that, how they started that 50 years ago. How are they doing that today? We've seen at Harvard, there's a lawsuit going on with the Asian students there that feel like they're being discriminated against because their test scores are too high, and you can't have that many Asians, that all of these groups having to hit certain metrics, lowering the standards. Talk about that in today's life.
Well, it continues what started in the 1960s. Today, universities have to discriminate against Asian American students if they want to keep their number of Black and Latino students. So at places at Yale, at Harvard, I believe the Justice Department is looking into Yale now. It's like the Jewish quotas in the 20th century. There are too many Asian students scoring well on the tests, and so they keep them out. I read once that an admissions counselor remarked that Asian students were less likely to go into the humanities and that they're too apolitical. Well, the humanities is where leftist professors want to indoctrinate students into accepting all kinds of ideas about postmodernism.
And you believe this is all a part of their plan, that there's a strategic effort by all these liberal professors to indoctrinate America's youth?
Well, they've become the establishment. It's not as if there's a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Their ideas won in the 1960s, and conservatives largely retreated from the university or just gave up. They believe that they are teaching students the truth. They're not, but that's what they believe.
You talked about the white liberals on college campuses and how disparaging they can be. Mm-hmm. But I want to talk about the 2020 candidates. You know, we've seen Bernie Sanders and other candidates all essentially calling for reparations. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that?
I think that reparations isn't a policy that's going to fix some of the issues afflicting Black America. And I would argue that universities have been themselves attempting to pay reparations in some degree since the 1960s. If you look at the reporting from that era, there was a consensus by college administrators that part of affirmative action, part of allocating tons of dollars in scholarships to students who wouldn't qualify on the merits was a part of repairing the breach that divided the races.
But why the uptick suddenly? I mean, the affirmative action piece has been going on for a minute, mm-hmm. but the reparations kind of died. You know, there were mm-hmm. small pockets of people talking much like socialism. People would be baffled to hear someone say, "Oh, America is now."
The reason is that Democrats don't take Black people seriously, and so they would rather sell some pie-in-the-sky policy than encourage people to fix the culture on the ground up in places where we're not seeing kids be as successful as they want to be. If Democrats cared about Blacks as much as they want, they wouldn't just ask for reparations. They would assume that the problems affecting Black America can be overcome, and they would look at ways to help Black America overcome those problems. And they would bring parents and teachers from other racial groups as well to come in and be honest about what people see in the classroom from the K through 12 level. They would be honest about what we see at the college level. They'd be honest about what we see in places like New York, where only 7 Black students are accepted into Stuyvesant High School. Something's wrong. We can fix this. We're Americans. But if 60 years after the Civil Rights Revolution, we see that math scores keep decreasing for Black students, reading scores keep decreasing, but somehow graduation rates go up, it means that something is very off.
So are they failing our students today, not just Black kids, but are they failing our kids today, higher education?
I would believe so, yeah. It's become a business. You know, these are corporations. They have lawyers that can silence students. They have millions of dollars to draw on. They have connections in the media. They've been allowed to do all of this stuff for 60 years and nobody talks about it.
Would it be fair to say that their objective is to indoctrinate the students so much so that it's essentially creating an army for the left?
I think that our universities have evolved into highly partisan think tanks that are creating new voters who think like them, yes. I think that they shouldn't receive federal dollars anymore, especially if they will exclude conservative professors from teaching and speaking there.
So we've identified the problem, right? We've talked about the examples, and there's numerous ones that you have listed, as well as we've reported on at Campus Reform every single day of the blatant liberal bias and the segregation that's happening on the college campus. What is the solution for all of this? Because there's people watching this and they're saying, where's the hope? We've already lost. You admitted that the conservative abandon the college campuses. What can they do now?
Well, at public universities that have segregated institutions and segregated curricula, we should seek what action we can take at the governmental level to close these houses down or to integrate them Colleges need to be teaching students what Americans have learned painfully before. Separate can never be equal.
But isn't it deeper than that? Isn't the housing and the segregation a symptom of the larger problem, the ideology? How do parents and students and people that love America combat the ideology that's on the college campus?
I don't know, maybe we've got to make conservatism cool again. We've got to show students that the left doesn't have the answers, that they're leading students adrift. Anyone who thinks that young black students in a complex economy should be reading Karl Marx or Michel Foucault instead of Adam Smith or even Kenneth Galbraith is out of their mind.
But how do the parents combat that? I mean, at Campus Reform, we report on it and we try to expose that.
I would encourage parents to...
Should they not send their kids to those schools?
No, they shouldn't. And elite conservatives should be sending their children to places like Hillsdale, places like St. Joseph's College, which still have retained much of their Western civilization curriculum, which doesn't play any of these racial games. Parents need to be alerted about this. They need to send their kids to other places. Their students are not learning. For $80,000 a year to learn to hate your country isn't an education.
There's been talk, and I don't want to go too far off on this, but even conservatives are tackling the cost of college. And there seemed to have been this shift once we got rid of the private loans and everything is through Sallie Mae. And the tuition just kept skyrocketing because there was no incentive for just admit them. If they failed, then they still have to repay the money back. Could there be some solution there tackling that issue?
We could dismantle the diversity regime. So much of the cost of college, so much of the rise in the cost of college can be attributed to the growth of the diversity regime, which starts with neo-segregation in the 1960s. The minority groups demanded new programs, new scholarships, new buildings, new academic centers, and ultimately administrators charged with bringing their vision to fruition. At Yale University, Peter Salovey appropriated $50 million towards a diversity initiative. At Brown University, it was something like $100 million. I mean, it's just, how much more money, how much more diversity and inclusion can you buy?
Would you say this is the number one threat on the college campuses today?
What is the number one threat?
The diversity, the separation of students, the anti-American, that liberal, the identity politics is the number one threat. Would you say that?
Absolutely. Students will carry these ideas from campus to career. Colleges are introducing them to a post-American style of government. You have minority student councils that bargain with the administration at the back door. Everyone else gets allocated what they need in a different way. If you look at our neo-segregation chart, you can see that Asian Americans always get the least of these programs. They have the fewest Asian American studies courses, the fewest Asian American cultural centers, the fewest Asian American graduation ceremonies. This entire ideology creates a hierarchy of victimhood in which each racial category gets what it wants according to its history or how aggrieved it feels. These are the kinds of ways students will think that they should negotiate with the United States government when they come out of college. You can just imagine students who were taught at Yale the past couple of years deciding that the system just moved too slowly for them and that maybe they should shut down Congress or
and
or
this is our
something like
next
that.
Doctors, lawyers,
educators, teachers, politicians. It's a shame, and it's not just. It's you have to understand that how toxic this is. At the Black Cultural Center at Yale University, there was a period during which they invited tons of anti-Semitic Black nationalist leaders to come speak against the objections of Jewish students on campus. These weren't guys who maybe had some issues with Israel's policy vis-a-vis Palestine. These were guys who came from the Nation of Islam, which teaches that Jews were the original Satan, and they came to Yale, one in 2003, accusing the Israeli government of planning 9/11, the black students who went to that event at Yale, a school that sends students to our government, to Goldman Sachs, they nodded their heads in agreement. So it's not just that racial tribalism on campus puts non-minority students against white students. It's that these splinter groups also indulge in anti-Semitism, the world's oldest form of hatred. It's race nationalism is toxic, and it makes people hate others. And what colleges tried to do was give black students a degree of pride. Everyone wanted to do that in the 1960s, but no one decided to use good judgment. And so Malcolm X, who taught some very, very hateful things, though he changed towards the end of his career, is considered to be a hero of black Americans in a way that he just isn't, because he encouraged them to look out and beyond the country in which they had to make success for themselves.
Still preach that message? Because you gave an example of Malcolm X. He left the Nation of Islam. Many still believe that the nation killed him.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
And so, are they teaching the real history,
no.
or are they taking advantage of people's emotions?
They lie. Doing this project was like investigating. It's like being an American spy in the Soviet Union. I mean, you have to decipher an entire language. You always have to think about what universities aren't saying. You know, the left has become the establishment. They are the corporations issuing impersonal statements and gaslighting the people into seeing things that aren't there, or to not seeing things that are there. And they lie all the time. You cannot find an accurate history of the black student movement on campus in the 1960s. You have to reconstruct it from the historical record supported by newspaper archives, essayists, other actual video footage of what happened. The literature describing the Black Power movement on campus is just full of falsehoods. It's not true. It also, the reason is that it isn't scholarly work. Black students coming to campus saw themselves as engaging in a political project. It wasn't about being inducted into the scholarly tradition of Madison, Aristotle, and Plato. It was about using academe to create a political program that they thought would liberate themselves. And they were wrong. They were very wrong. We've had 50 years of this. How many, do we have more black Secretary of States, foreign ambassadors, CEOs of Goldman Sachs, more lawyers? It seems that certain problems, at least for the black working class, have gotten worse. Meanwhile, so many schools in the country have black studies. And that's where they send black students when they get to college.
And you think this is by design. Where can our audience find more about this research that you did? And your next project that you're going to, because I'm sure you're going to be tackling this for a minute.
So we'll be doing neo-segregation for a while. It's an ongoing project. The next case study we will publish will be about Brown University, which has some very, very interesting incidents there. One of which includes a time when black students decided to harass a young white female for dating a black guy. And what that shows often is that the students in neo-segregated programs behave no differently than white racists. This is another way in which Americans are more alike than they realize. You see black students and white students copying each other. You can see that now with the proliferating white student union groups that are coming up. Black students set the model for identity politics for other minority groups, and now it looks like whites may copy that as well. And that's a very, very bad sign.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dion. We appreciate it. You can go to the National Association of Scholars to see more of Dion's work. Go to campusreform.org to see all the stories, some of these examples that Dion was talking about. Go to our YouTube channel as well, see some of our videos. Thank you so much. I'm Lawrence Jones, Editor-in-Chief of Campus Reform. Until next time. Hi, it's Lawrence Jones with Campus Reform. If you like that video you just saw, you can donate right here to help us make more of them. And if you want to subscribe, click right here.